The gavel struck like thunder, its echo bouncing off marble walls as 6-year-old twins screamed in unison, "Mama Grace! Mama Grace!" Their desperate cries pierced through the stunned courtroom's silence, tiny fists pounding against the mahogany barrier separating them from the woman being led away in handcuffs. Grace Washington's dignity never wavered, even as steel cuffs bit into her dark wrists. Chaos erupted instantly. Olivia collapsed to her knees, hyperventilating. Owen threw himself at the bailiff's legs, his small body trembling with rage. Alexander Sterling, tech billionaire worth $2.8 billion, sat frozen in his $1,000 suit, tears streaming down his face like a broken man. 8 months ago, these children couldn't speak, couldn't sleep, couldn't trust anyone. Now they were whole again, and the woman who'd saved them was being torn away like a criminal. "Custody denied," Judge Morrison repeated coldly. "The children will remain with their legal guardian, Victoria Ashworth." How had love become a crime? How had salvation turned into damnation? And why was the one person who'd given these broken babies their voices back now being silenced forever? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 8 months earlier, Alexander Sterling stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Palo Alto mansion, watching another nanny speed down his circular driveway like she was fleeing a crime scene. The 14th one this year. Behind him, muffled crashes and screaming echoed from the sealed playroom where his 6-year-old twins had barricaded themselves again. "Mr. Sterling?" His housekeeper's voice trembled through the intercom. "The cleaning service is here, but maybe today isn't—" "Send them up," Alexander cut her off, his reflection ghost-like against the glass. At 45, the tech mogul who'd revolutionized artificial intelligence looked like a man haunted by algorithms he couldn't solve. His wife Sarah's death 18 months ago had shattered more than his heart. It had broken his children's ability to trust, to sleep, to simply exist without terror. The twins hadn't spoken his name since the funeral. They communicated only in screams and silence, their world a rotating door of caregivers who quit within days. Olivia's selective mutism deepened weekly. Owen's violent outbursts sent 3 nannies to urgent care. Child psychologists used words like severe attachment disorder and complex trauma, but their expensive recommendations meant nothing when his children treated every adult like an enemy. Grace Washington climbed the marble staircase with industrial cleaning supplies, her uniform crisp despite the early hour. At 42, the woman carried herself with quiet dignity that expensive clothes couldn't manufacture. Her supervisor had warned her about this house. Rich family, troubled kids, don't get involved, but Grace needed every dollar from her 3 jobs to survive in Silicon Valley's brutal economy. She'd moved here from Atlanta 6 months ago, running from memories that still woke her screaming. Her one-room apartment in East Palo Alto was a palace compared to sleeping in her Honda Civic, though both felt like punishment for sins she couldn't name. The bills from her son Marcus's cancer treatment followed her across the country like ghosts, and bankruptcy had claimed everything except her grandmother's wedding ring. The playroom door stood slightly ajar when Grace reached the 2nd floor. Through the gap, she glimpsed 2 small figures huddled behind an overturned table fort, whispering in their secret twin language. Olivia's dark hair hung in tangles around tear-stained cheeks. Owen clutched a stuffed elephant with one ear missing, his blue eyes wild with exhaustion. Something familiar stirred in Grace's chest. The same instinct that once made her the youngest pediatric surgeon in Georgia before everything fell apart. These weren't problem children. They were drowning children, gasping for someone to throw them a lifeline instead of another lecture about behavior modification. The housekeeper appeared, wringing her hands. "They've been like this since yesterday. The nanny just left, didn't even collect her final check." Grace set down her supplies and approached the door slowly. the way she once approached skittish patients in the ER. "Hey there," she whispered, her voice carrying the warmth of Southern gospel hymns. "You all sound like you could use a friend." Both children went absolutely still, as if they'd heard something impossible. Grace knelt beside the overturned table, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The twins watched her with the wariness of wild animals who'd been cornered too many times. She'd seen this look before, in the pediatric ICU, in children who'd learned that adults brought pain disguised as help. "I'm Grace," she said softly, settling cross-legged on the hardwood floor. "What are your names?" Olivia pressed deeper into Owen's side, her lips sealed tight. Owen's grip on his elephant intensified until his knuckles went white. They'd perfected the art of silence as protection, but Grace recognized the language of trauma. She'd spoken it fluently once. "You know what?" Grace reached into her cleaning cart and pulled out a small bottle of bubbles, something she carried from her old life, when hospital corridors echoed with children's laughter instead of machines. "My grandmother used to tell me that bubbles carry wishes to heaven." "Y'all want to send some wishes up?" She blew a gentle stream of iridescent spheres that floated between them like tiny promises. Owen's eyes followed their ascent with wonder he'd forgotten he possessed. When one landed on Olivia's nose, the ghost of a smile flickered across her face. "Owen," the boy whispered suddenly, his voice rusty from disuse. "Olivia," his sister breathed, barely audible. Grace's heart clenched with recognition. "Those are beautiful names. My grandmother was named Olivia, too." She wasn't lying. Her grandmother's middle name had been Olivia, though she'd never used it. But these children needed truth, wrapped in hope, not harsh reality. "Where's your mama?" Owen asked, the question tumbling out before he could stop it. The silence stretched thin as wire. Grace's throat tightened, remembering 8-year-old Marcus asking the same question about his father who'd fled when the cancer diagnosis came. Some truths were too heavy for small shoulders. "My mama's with the angels," Grace said finally, "but she taught me how to take care of little ones who hurt. She said hurt hearts need extra gentle hands." "Our mama's with the angels too," Olivia whispered, her first words in weeks. "Daddy says it's his fault." The pieces clicked together in Grace's mind, the mansion's suffocating grief, the man downstairs who looked like he carried the weight of the world, the children who'd learned that love meant loss. She'd walked into a house where everyone was drowning separately. "Sometimes grown-ups think they understand things they don't," Grace said carefully. "Angels don't blame anybody for coming home. They just wait with lots of love." For the next hour, Grace forgot about her cleaning duties. She sat in that playroom, weaving stories about brave elephants and twin princesses who protected each other from dragons made of sadness. Owen's elephant became Sir Peanut, guardian of the Bubble Kingdom. Olivia emerged from behind the table to help blow wishes toward the ceiling. When Alexander's voice thundered up the stairs, "Where is everyone? What's taking so long?" Both children instinctively moved closer to Grace. She felt their small bodies trembling, preparing for another adult storm. "Mr. Sterling's home," the housekeeper's voice carried from the hallway, pitched high with anxiety. Grace stood slowly, brushing dust from her uniform. "It's okay, babies. Sometimes daddies forget how to use their inside voices when they're worried." Alexander appeared in the doorway like a thundercloud in an Armani suit, his jaw tight with the stress of another failed conference call with Tokyo. The sight that greeted him stopped him cold. His children, who hadn't voluntarily touched another adult in months, flanked Grace like she was their shield against the world. "What's going on here?" His voice carried the sharp edge of a man accustomed to immediate answers. "We're making friends with Sir Peanut," Owen said solemnly, holding up his elephant. "Grace says elephants never forget people they love." Alexander's expression shifted from suspicion to something more complex. He'd paid specialists $500 an hour to get Owen to speak in their presence. This stranger in a cleaning uniform had accomplished in minutes what months of therapy couldn't touch. "I'm sorry," Grace said, stepping forward. "I know I'm supposed to be cleaning, but they seemed scared." Alexander finished quietly, seeing his children clearly for perhaps the first time since Sarah's funeral. They weren't defiant or damaged. They were terrified. And somehow this woman had made them feel safe enough to remember how to be children. "The nanny quit yesterday," he said, his business mind already calculating. "I don't suppose you know anything about child care?" Grace glanced at the twins, who looked up at her with desperate hope. She thought of her empty apartment, her stacks of medical bills, her 3 jobs that barely kept her afloat. She thought of Marcus, who would have been Owen's age if the cancer hadn't stolen him. "I know about taking care of people who hurt," she said simply. $200 a day, Alexander said abruptly. "Cash, starting now." Behind him, Grace didn't see the housekeeper crossing herself and whispering prayers of gratitude. She only saw 2 small faces looking at her like she might be the answer to wishes they'd been too afraid to make. 3 weeks passed like a dream Grace was afraid to trust. The Sterling mansion transformed from a mausoleum of grief into something resembling a home. Olivia spoke in complete sentences now, her voice growing stronger each day. Owen's violent outbursts disappeared, replaced by the curious energy of a 6-year-old discovering the world was safe enough to explore. Grace arrived each morning at 7 sharp, her uniform pressed, and her heart full of purpose she'd thought was buried with Marcus. The twins waited for her by the front window, noses pressed against glass, faces lighting up like Christmas morning when her bus rounded the corner. They'd created routines that felt sacred. Morning songs while making breakfast, afternoon story time in the garden, evening baths filled with laughter instead of tears. Alexander watched these transformations from the periphery, still too raw to fully participate but gradually thawing. He found himself coming home earlier, making excuses to linger in doorways where he could hear Grace's warm laughter mixing with his children's voices. She never overstepped boundaries with him, maintaining professional distance even as she became the emotional center of his children's universe. The night everything changed began like any other. Alexander flew to Seattle for emergency meetings with Microsoft executives, his private jet lifting off just as storm clouds gathered over the Bay Area. Grace stayed late because Olivia was running a slight fever, and Owen refused to sleep without his twin nearby. She'd called Alexander's assistant to confirm the arrangement, something she did religiously to maintain transparency. By midnight, the fever broke and both children slept peacefully in the master bedroom's sitting area, where Grace had created a makeshift sick bay with extra pillows and humidifiers. The master bedroom itself remained untouched, Alexander's private sanctuary that Grace respected absolutely. But the children felt safer in the familiar space that still carried faint traces of their mother's perfume. Grace dozed fitfully in the velvet armchair between the twin beds she'd moved from their room, her body curved protectively toward her charges. The storm outside grew violent, thunder rattling windows and lightning illuminating the mansion in stark flashes. Around 3 a.m., both children began crying simultaneously, not from fever, but from the night terrors that still plagued them during storms. "The car's crashing again," Owen sobbed, his small body shaking with memories too big for his frame. "I can hear Mama screaming," Olivia whimpered, reaching desperately for Grace's hands. Grace knew the only thing that calmed these episodes was physical comfort, skin-to-skin contact that proved they weren't alone in the darkness. She'd learned this through trial and heartbreak, watching them suffer through dozens of nights before discovering what worked. Dr. Martinez, their therapist, had confirmed that therapeutic touch was crucial for children with attachment trauma. Without hesitation, Grace gathered both trembling bodies against her on the king-sized bed, creating a protective cocoon with her arms. She hummed the lullaby her grandmother had sung during her own childhood storms, the same melody that had comforted Marcus through countless nights in the hospital. The children's breathing gradually steadied, their grip on her shirt loosening as peace returned. Grace remained vigilant even as they slept, monitoring Olivia's temperature and watching for signs of distress. The bed was so vast that she kept to one edge, the children between her and empty space, maintaining appropriate boundaries even in crisis. She dozed intermittently, jerking awake at every sound to check on her charges. Alexander's red-eye flight landed early due to favorable winds. The Seattle deal had collapsed spectacularly, Microsoft's executives walking out after his distracted performance during crucial negotiations. His mind had been at home all night, worry gnawing at him about Olivia's fever and the approaching storm. He'd tried calling multiple times, but Grace's phone had died and the house landline wasn't working due to weather interference. He arrived home at 6 a.m., exhaustion and anxiety making his movements sharp and hurried. The house was too quiet. Usually he heard voices and morning routines by now. Fear spiked through him as he climbed the stairs 3 at a time, his imagination conjuring scenarios of medical emergencies or accidents. The master bedroom door stood slightly ajar, morning light filtering through storm-cleared windows. Alexander pushed it open and froze, his tired brain struggling to process the scene before him. Grace lay in his bed, his wife's bed, with both children curled against her like she belonged there. Olivia's small hand rested on Grace's collarbone. Owen's head nestled in the crook of her arm. All three breathed peacefully, unaware of his presence. Something primitive and ugly roared to life in Alexander's chest. This was Sarah's sacred space. The bed where his wife had died in his arms 18 months ago, the sanctuary he'd preserved exactly as she'd left it. Seeing another woman there, a black woman whose very presence challenged everything his privileged upbringing had taught him about proper boundaries, triggered responses he didn't know he possessed. The image seared itself into his memory with devastating clarity. Grace's dark skin against his wife's white silk pillowcases, her worn uniform rumpled from sleep, her natural hair freed from its usual neat bun. To his grief-addled mind, poisoned by exhaustion and societal conditioning he'd never examined, it looked like violation rather than healing. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The words exploded from him like bullets, sharp enough to shatter glass. Grace jolted awake, immediately disoriented and vulnerable. The children stirred but didn't wake, their bodies instinctively seeking her warmth even as she tried to sit up without disturbing them. "Mr. Sterling, I can explain," Grace began, her voice thick with sleep and rising panic. "In my bed." Alexander's voice climbed to dangerous levels, all rational thought consumed by grief-fueled rage. "In my wife's bed. What kind of sick game is this?" The accusations hit Grace like physical blows. She saw herself suddenly through his eyes, a black domestic worker in his sanctuary, vulnerable and exposed. Every stereotype, every whispered warning about boundaries and appearances, every lesson learned in childhood about how quickly safety could turn to danger, crashed over her like a tsunami. "The children were sick," she whispered, trying desperately to maintain dignity while extracting herself from the bed without waking the twins. "They had night terrors. I was just—" "You were just what? Taking advantage? Getting comfortable?" Alexander's voice carried undertones that made Grace's blood run cold. She'd heard those tones before, in other wealthy homes, from other employers who'd made her feel like a predator for simply existing in their spaces. Owen stirred at the angry voices, his eyes opening to find his father looming over them like an avenging angel. "Daddy?" he whispered, confusion clouding his features. "Get out," Alexander said, his voice deadly quiet now. Get out of my house. Now. The children were fully awake now, sitting up in bed with growing horror as they realized their world was shattering again. They'd learned to read adult faces like weather patterns, and the storm brewing in their father's expression promised devastation. "Daddy, no!" Olivia cried, launching herself toward Grace. "She helped us. We were scared." But Alexander was beyond hearing reason, beyond seeing anything but betrayal and violation in a situation that had been nothing but love and protection. The grief he'd suppressed for 18 months erupted like a volcano, and Grace became the target for every failure, every loss, every moment of helplessness he'd endured since Sarah's death. "Security will escort you out," he said coldly, already reaching for his phone. "Don't ever come back." The security guards arrived within minutes, their black uniforms and cold efficiency transforming the mansion into a crime scene. Grace gathered her few belongings with shaking hands while the twins screamed from upstairs, their cries echoing through marble hallways like wounded animals. Alexander had locked them in their rooms, for their own good, but their desperate voices followed Grace to the front door. "Mama! Grace! Mama! Grace! Don't leave us!" Each word was a knife to her heart. She'd promised them she would never abandon them, that she was different from all the others who'd walked away. Now she was breaking that promise, led out in shame like a criminal, while the children who loved her begged for mercy their father wouldn't grant. The head of security, a weathered man named Frank who'd worked for the Sterling family for 15 years, looked uncomfortable as he escorted Grace to the gate. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "for what it's worth, I've never seen those kids happy until you came along." Grace nodded wordlessly, her throat too tight for speech. The morning sun felt mockingly bright as she walked down the long driveway, her small bag containing everything she owned. Behind her, the mansion stood like a fortress, beautiful and impenetrable, sealing away the only family she'd known since Marcus died. By afternoon, the twins had stopped screaming. By evening, they'd stopped speaking entirely. Alexander found them huddled together in Olivia's closet, clutching each other with the desperate intensity of survivors in a shipwreck. They wouldn't eat, wouldn't respond to his voice, wouldn't even look at him. It was as if they'd disappeared inside themselves, leaving only hollow shells behind. Dr. Martinez arrived within hours of Alexander's panicked call. The child psychologist took one look at the twins and immediately recommended emergency intervention. "You've essentially recreated their original trauma," she told Alexander bluntly. "Another caregiver they trusted has been violently removed from their lives. This could set them back years." "She was inappropriate," Alexander insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "I found her in my bed, with sick children who trusted her enough to seek comfort," Dr. Martinez countered. "Mr. Sterling, these children have severe attachment disorders." Grace Washington was the first adult they'd bonded with since their mother's death. Removing her so abruptly, so violently, has confirmed their worst fears, that love always ends in abandonment. Alexander paced his office, his empire of artificial intelligence unable to solve the human crisis in his own home. Stock prices meant nothing when his son hadn't spoken in 3 days and his daughter had started pulling out her own hair. "What do I do?" "Find her," Dr. Martinez said simply. "Apologize. Bring her back before it's too late." But finding Grace proved more difficult than Alexander anticipated. She'd given the cleaning service a false address, actually a homeless shelter in San Jose where she'd stayed briefly after first arriving in California. The shelter's director, a stern woman named Sister Catherine, looked at Alexander's $1,000 suit and Rolex with undisguised suspicion. "Grace Washington worked here for a month," Sister Catherine said carefully. "Good woman, gentle with the children, never complained about sleeping on a cot in our overflow room." "Why are you looking for her?" Alexander's carefully rehearsed explanation died in his throat under the nun's penetrating stare. made a mistake, a terrible mistake. Rich men make mistakes, Sister Catherine observed. Poor women pay for them. What kind of mistake? The story poured out of him, his grief, his fear, his unconscious prejudices that had turned protection into accusation. Sister Catherine listened without judgment, her weathered hands folded in her lap like she'd heard similar confessions countless times. She's working 3 jobs now, the nun said finally, cleaning offices downtown at night, serving breakfast at Mel's Diner from 5 to noon, stocking shelves at the grocery store in the afternoons, sleeping in her car between shifts. Alexander's stomach clenched with shame. 3 jobs? Rent in this area costs what you probably spend on lunch. Grace is barely surviving, but she won't take charity. Says she's got to earn her way back to dignity. Sister Catherine studied his face. What are you going to do about it? Alexander found Grace at Mel's Diner on Mission Street at 11 p.m., her uniform stained with coffee and exhaustion etched into every line of her face. She was cleaning tables with mechanical precision, her movements efficient but joyless. When she looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, her entire body went rigid with defensive tension. Grace? Her name felt foreign on his tongue after days of its absence. We need to talk. I'm working, she said quietly, not meeting his eyes. My shift doesn't end until midnight. Then I'll wait. He sat in a corner booth for an hour, nursing lukewarm coffee and watching Grace serve late-night customers with the same gentle attention she'd given his children. She remembered how everyone liked their eggs, asked about their families, treated each person like they mattered. It was a gift, he realized. This ability to see dignity in everyone regardless of their station. When midnight came, Grace untied her apron with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion. She approached his table like someone walking toward a firing squad. The children, she said without preamble. How are they? Broken, Alexander admitted. They won't eat, won't speak. Olivia's started self-harming. Owen tried to run away twice, saying he was looking for you. Grace's composure cracked for just a moment, pain flashing across her features like lightning. I'm sorry. I'm the one who should apologize. Alexander's voice was raw with regret. I was wrong. Completely, inexcusably wrong. You were protecting them, and I let my grief and my prejudices turn that into something ugly. Your prejudices, Grace repeated quietly. At least you're honest about what it was. The words hit like a physical blow because they were true. Alexander had spent his entire life thinking he was above such things, that his liberal politics and charitable donations inoculated him against bias. But when confronted with a black woman in his most intimate space, primitive fears and stereotypes had erupted from depths he'd never acknowledged. Come back, he said desperately. Please, they need you. Grace was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of generations of women who'd been forced to choose between dignity and survival. I can't go back to being seen as a threat in that house. I can't live under suspicion, waiting for the next time you look at me and see danger instead of devotion. She met his eyes for the first time. Those babies deserve better than a caregiver who's constantly defending her right to love them. It won't happen again, Alexander promised. I swear to you. How can you swear to something you didn't even know was inside you? Grace asked. You didn't wake up that morning planning to destroy everything good in your children's lives. You just did it, because somewhere deep down, you'd been taught that people who look like me don't belong in places that look like your house. The accusation hung between them like a blade, sharp and surgical in its accuracy. Alexander wanted to deny it, to explain that he wasn't that kind of person, but the evidence of his actions spoke louder than his intentions. 3 days later, Margaret Sterling arrived from Boston unannounced, her 72-year-old frame radiating the authority of someone accustomed to fixing her son's mistakes. She took one look at her catatonic grandchildren and immediately demanded answers. When Alexander confessed what had happened, his mother's reaction was swift and devastating. "You did what?" Margaret's voice could have frozen fire. "You threw out the first person to reach those children since Sarah died? Alexander James Sterling, I raised you better than this." "Mother, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly. Your father used to get the same look when he felt threatened by people he thought were beneath him. I spent 40 years teaching him better, and I thought I'd taught you better too." Margaret's disappointment was more cutting than anger. "Where is this woman now?" Margaret found Grace at the homeless shelter, volunteering her few free hours to help children whose situations were even more desperate than her own. The elderly matriarch approached with the directness of someone who'd never had to waste time on pretense. "My son is an educated fool," Margaret announced without preamble. "But his children are dying without you, and I'm too old to watch babies suffer for their father's stupidity." Grace looked up from the coloring book she was sharing with a 5-year-old girl whose mother was in rehab. "Mrs. Sterling?" "Margaret, and before you say anything, let me tell you what I found in my daughter-in-law's belongings." Margaret pulled out a worn leather journal, its pages filled with Sarah's careful handwriting. "She wrote about you, near the end when she knew she was struggling. She'd researched you, wanted to hire you to help with the children if anything happened to her." Grace's breath caught. "She knew about me? Former pediatric surgeon turned miracle worker with traumatized children. Sarah found articles about your work in Atlanta, parents praising your unconventional methods." Margaret's eyes softened. "She was planning to contact you the week she died. Said you understood loss in ways that might help Olivia and Owen heal." The revelation hit Grace like a physical blow. Sarah had known, had chosen her deliberately, not as a random cleaning lady, but as someone uniquely qualified to love her children through their darkest hours. The cosmic injustice of it, that she'd found her way to the Sterling family anyway, only to be cast out for fulfilling Sarah's dying wish, threatened to overwhelm her completely. "Those children upstairs are fading away," Margaret continued. "Olivia hasn't spoken since you left. Owen keeps asking when you're coming back, and when we say we don't know, he just stares at the ceiling like he's waiting to join his mother." Alexander knows he was wrong, but knowing and fixing are different things. "I can't go back to the way things were," Grace said firmly. "I won't be the help who's grateful for scraps of acceptance. If I return, it has to be as family." Margaret smiled for the first time since arriving in California. "Then we'd better make my son understand what family actually means." The confrontation between mother and son was epic in its scope and devastating in its precision. Margaret Sterling had spent decades navigating Boston society's complex hierarchies, and she understood exactly how to dismantle her son's defenses. She presented Sarah's journal like evidence in a trial, reading passages aloud that painted Grace not as an interloper, but as an answer to prayers Alexander had been too grief-stricken to make. "Your wife wanted this woman to raise your children," Margaret said coldly, "and you threw her out like garbage because you couldn't see past the color of her skin." "How do you think Sarah would feel about that?" Alexander sat in his leather chair, feeling smaller than he had since childhood. The weight of his mistakes pressed down like a physical force, threatening to crush what remained of his soul. "How do I fix this?" "You don't fix it," Margaret said. "You rebuild it, from the ground up, with honesty, with respect, and with the understanding that Grace Washington doesn't need your charity, you need her grace." When Grace returned to the mansion a week later, she came not as an employee, but as a partner in healing. Alexander had spent those 7 days in intensive therapy with Dr. Martinez, excavating the unconscious biases that had nearly destroyed his family. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, as if removing the weight of unspoken prejudices had allowed love to breathe again. The twins' reunion with Grace was a masterpiece of contained emotion. They approached her carefully, afraid to believe she was real, afraid to hope she would stay. When she knelt and opened her arms, they collapsed into her embrace like they were coming home from war. "Are you staying forever?" Olivia whispered against her neck. "If you'll have me," Grace whispered back, meeting Alexander's eyes over their heads. "If your daddy promises to see me for who I really am." "I promise," Alexander said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I promise to do better, to be better, for them and for you." The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Trust, once shattered, required patient reconstruction. But as Grace tucked the twins into bed that night, in their own rooms, with new boundaries that respected everyone's dignity, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Marcus died: hope that love might triumph over fear, that healing was possible even after devastating betrayal. Outside, Margaret Sterling smiled from her guest room window as she watched her fractured family begin the delicate work of becoming whole. 2 months of careful rebuilding had transformed the Sterling household into something approaching normalcy when Victoria Ashworth arrived like a storm front gathering on the horizon. Sarah's younger sister swept through the front door with the predatory grace of someone accustomed to making opposing counsel tremble, her designer heels clicking against marble with military precision. "Hello, Alexander." Victoria's voice carried honeyed poison as she surveyed the foyer where children's laughter echoed from upstairs. "I see you've made some interesting staffing choices." Alexander tensed immediately, recognizing the calculated coldness in his sister-in-law's tone. Victoria had been notably absent since Sarah's funeral, emerging only for awkward holiday visits that left everyone uncomfortable. Her sudden appearance now, unannounced and armed with a briefcase, set every alarm bell ringing. "Victoria, I didn't know you were coming." Alexander's business instincts kicked in, his voice carefully neutral. "I'm sure you didn't." Victoria's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "We need to talk. About the children's welfare. About your judgment concerning their care." Upstairs, Grace was teaching the twins how to braid friendship bracelets when she heard the unfamiliar voice floating up from the foyer. Something in its tone made her skin prickle with instinctive warning. Olivia noticed her tension immediately, her small face clouding with anxiety. "Is someone angry downstairs?" the little girl whispered. "I don't know, baby," Grace said softly, but her grandmother's gift for reading people was screaming danger. "Why don't you and Owen keep working on these beautiful bracelets while I check on your daddy?" Grace descended the staircase quietly, catching fragments of conversation that made her blood run cold. Words like inappropriate relationship and unsuitable environment drifted up like smoke signals of coming disaster. Victoria stood in the living room like a general surveying a battlefield, her sharp suit and severe bun radiating authority. She was undeniably beautiful in the way of women who weaponized their appearance. Tall, blonde, with Sarah's bone structure refined into something harder and more dangerous. When her cold blue eyes landed on Grace, they narrowed with satisfaction. "And you must be the nanny," Victoria said, her tone making the words sound like an accusation. "I'm Grace Washington," Grace replied with quiet dignity, extending her hand in a gesture of courtesy that Victoria pointedly ignored. "Yes, I've heard quite a lot about you." Victoria's smile was venomous. "How you've made yourself indispensable to my sister's family. How you've managed to insert yourself into such an intimate position of trust. It's quite remarkable, really." The words carried undertones that made Grace's stomach clench with familiar dread. She'd heard similar implications before in other wealthy homes, from other people who looked at her and saw threat instead of competence. But coming from Sarah's sister, delivered in Alexander's living room while the children played innocently upstairs, the attack felt particularly cruel. "Grace has been wonderful with the children," Alexander said firmly, stepping closer to show support. "They've made incredible progress since she arrived." "I'm sure they have," Victoria agreed with false sweetness. "Children do tend to form attachments to their caregivers. The question is whether those attachments are healthy or simply convenient for the adults involved." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas, its implications clear to everyone present. Victoria was suggesting something unthinkable, painting Grace's love for the children as something calculated and manipulative. The suggestion was so far from reality it took Grace's breath away. "What exactly are you implying?" Alexander's voice dropped to dangerous levels. "I'm not implying anything," Victoria said smoothly. "I'm simply observing that my niece and nephew have become unusually dependent on their caregiver. Some might say unhealthily so. What happens when she decides to move on to her next position? When she finds a family that can offer her better opportunities?" The words were chosen with surgical precision, designed to plant seeds of doubt without making direct accusations that could be challenged in court. Victoria was a master manipulator, and she was playing a long game that none of them fully understood yet. Grace felt the familiar weight of being forced to defend her basic humanity. "I love those children," she said quietly. "They're not a job to me. They're family." "Family," Victoria repeated, tasting the word like something distasteful. "How interesting. And what exactly does family mean to you, Miss Washington? Because in my experience, hired help who claim to be family are usually positioning themselves for something more than just a paycheck." The attack was so vicious, so calculatedly cruel, that Alexander stepped forward protectively. "That's enough, Victoria. Grace has done nothing but help us heal." "Has she?" Victoria's eyebrows rose in feigned surprise. "Because from where I'm standing it looks like she's isolated two vulnerable children from their extended family, made them dependent on her exclusively, and positioned herself as their primary attachment figure. Some might call that grooming." The word hit like a physical blow. Grace actually staggered, her hand reaching for the wall to steady herself. To have her love for the children twisted into something so ugly, so wrong, felt like having her heart torn from her chest. "You need to leave," Alexander said, his voice shaking with rage. "Right now." "Actually, I don't." Victoria pulled a thick folder from her briefcase with theatrical flourish. "I filed for emergency custody of Olivia and Owen. The hearing is scheduled for next week." The words detonated in the room like a bomb. Alexander went white, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Grace felt the world tilt beneath her feet as the implications crashed over her like a tsunami. "You can't be serious," Alexander whispered. "I'm dead serious. These children need stability, not whatever this is." Victoria gestured dismissively between Alexander and Grace. "They need a proper family environment with appropriate boundaries and suitable role models." "I'm their father," Alexander said, his voice growing stronger with outrage. "A father who clearly lacks judgment concerning their welfare. A father who allows inappropriate relationships to develop under his roof. A father who puts his own needs before his children's well-being." Victoria's voice was clinical, devastating in its precision. "The court will be very interested in hearing about the sleeping arrangements, the boundary violations, the way these children have been isolated from their blood relatives." Grace realized with growing horror that Victoria had been watching, gathering information, building a case. Every innocent moment, every bedtime story, every comforting hug, every night spent soothing nightmares, was being twisted into evidence of something sinister. My investigator has been very thorough, Victoria continued conversationally. The incident with Miss Washington in your bed, for instance, most concerning. The way the children have been programmed to reject other caregivers in favor of their current guardian. The financial arrangement that seems remarkably generous for domestic help. Each word was a knife thrust, precise and calculated to cause maximum damage. Alexander's face was cycling through expressions of shock, rage, and growing understanding that this was a coordinated attack designed to destroy everything they'd built. Sarah loved these children, Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. She would never want them torn away from their father. Sarah is dead, Victoria snapped, her composure cracking for the first time. And maybe if her husband had been paying attention to his family instead of his business empire, she'd still be alive. The accusation hung in the air like a curse. Alexander flinched as if he'd been slapped, the guilt he carried about Sarah's death rising to choke him. Victoria saw his reaction and smiled with predatory satisfaction. Yes, let's talk about that night, she continued relentlessly. How you were working late again. How Sarah was driving alone in the rain because you couldn't be bothered to come home for dinner. How she died in a car accident that might have been prevented if her husband had actually been present in her life. Stop, Alexander whispered, but Victoria was just getting started. Now you're repeating the same pattern, bringing strangers into your home while you disappear into your work, allowing your children to form unhealthy attachments to people who will inevitably leave them. How long before Miss Washington finds a better offer? How long before she disappears and breaks their hearts all over again? The attack was masterfully crafted, designed to exploit every fear, every insecurity, every trauma that defined the Sterling family. Victoria wasn't just seeking custody, she was systematically destroying their ability to function as a unit. Grace watched Alexander crumble under the assault and felt her own heart breaking. She could see him beginning to doubt, beginning to wonder if Victoria was right about the dangers of their arrangement. The man who had promised to see her for who she really was being manipulated into seeing her as a threat again. The hearing is next Thursday at 10 a.m., Victoria said, gathering her papers with brisk efficiency. I suggest you both prepare yourselves for some uncomfortable questions about boundaries, appropriateness, and what's really best for Olivia and Owen. She paused at the door, delivering her final blow with surgical precision. Oh, and Miss Washington, you might want to consider whether dragging these children through a custody battle is really an act of love. Sometimes the most caring thing is to simply disappear. After Victoria left, the house felt poisoned, as if her words had contaminated the very air they breathed. Alexander sat heavily in his chair, his head in his hands, while Grace stood frozen in the hallway, feeling like the ground had opened beneath her feet. Upstairs, the twins called for her to come see their finished bracelets, their voices bright with innocent joy. They had no idea that their world was about to be torn apart again, that the woman who loved them was being painted as their destroyer. Grace climbed the stairs on unsteady legs, her heart breaking with every step. When she reached the playroom and saw their eager faces, their complete trust in her protection, she almost collapsed under the weight of her love for them and her terror of losing them. Look, Mama Grace. Olivia held up a bracelet woven in purple and gold. I made this one for you. Owen made one for Daddy. We're all connected now. The innocent declaration was like a sword through Grace's chest. Connected, family. Everything Victoria was determined to destroy in the name of protecting them. It's beautiful, baby, Grace whispered, slipping the bracelet onto her wrist where it felt like both a blessing and a chain. The most beautiful thing I've ever seen. That night, as she tucked them into bed and sang their grandmother's lullaby, Grace made a decision that would haunt her forever. She kissed their foreheads with extra tenderness, memorizing the weight of their small bodies in her arms, the trust in their sleepy voices as they whispered, "I love you, Mama Grace." Because Victoria was right about one thing. Sometimes love meant making impossible sacrifices. And if the only way to protect these children from a devastating custody battle was to remove herself from the equation, then that's what she would do, even if it killed her. Grace left at dawn while the house still slept, carrying nothing but a worn duffel bag and a heart heavy enough to sink ships. She moved through the mansion like a ghost, memorizing details she'd never see again, the way morning light painted rainbows through the crystal chandelier, the faint scent of lavender from Olivia's room, the indent in the leather chair where she'd spent countless evenings reading to the children. On the kitchen counter, she left a letter that took her 3 attempts to write. The final version was simple, devastating in its brevity. Some fights aren't worth the casualties they create. Take care of our babies. They deserve better than this war. Grace. She walked the 7 miles to the Greyhound station in the pre-dawn darkness, her grandmother's wedding ring, her last possession of value, clutched in her palm. The ticket agent, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, accepted the ring without question when Grace explained she needed passage to anywhere far from California. "Georgia," the woman suggested, noting Grace's accent. "Bus leaves in 2 hours." "Georgia," Grace agreed, though the word felt like swallowing glass. She was running home to a place that had never really been home, back to memories that would offer no comfort. Alexander discovered her absence when he came downstairs at 7, expecting to find Grace preparing the twins' breakfast, as she had every morning for months. The empty kitchen felt cavernous, wrong in ways that made his chest tighten with premonition. When he found the letter, he read it 3 times before the words penetrated his shock. The twins' reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Olivia found Grace's room first, saw the stripped bed and empty closet, and began screaming with a sound that seemed to tear from her soul. Owen joined her within seconds, both children collapsing into hysteria that no amount of comfort could touch. "Where is she?" Olivia shrieked, clawing at Alexander's shirt. "Where's Mama Grace? You made her leave. You made her go away." Alexander tried to hold them, tried to explain, but his words meant nothing against their raw terror. They'd been abandoned before, by death, by neglect, by a parade of caregivers who'd treated them like problems to be solved rather than children to be loved. Grace's disappearance triggered every trauma response they'd spent months healing. Dr. Martinez arrived within the hour, summoned by Alexander's desperate phone call. She took one look at the hyperventilating children and immediately recommended emergency sedation. "This level of distress can cause lasting psychological damage," she warned. "Where is Grace? They need to see her, need to understand this isn't permanent abandonment." "She's gone," Alexander said helplessly. "Victoria filed for custody yesterday. Grace thought if she removed herself from the situation, it would protect the children." "Protect them?" Dr. Martinez's voice rose with professional outrage. "She's recreated their primary trauma. These children have now lost 2 mother figures in 18 months. Their developing brains are interpreting this as proof that love equals loss, that attachment equals abandonment." The sedatives helped quiet the twins' screams but couldn't touch their deeper wounds. They lay in the hospital bed like broken dolls, staring at nothing with eyes that had seen too much loss for their young hearts to process. Owen hadn't spoken since Grace's disappearance. Olivia whispered her name like a prayer, as if repetition could summon her back. Alexander sat vigil beside their bed, watching his children fade before his eyes. Every business success, every technological breakthrough, every billion-dollar deal meant nothing in the face of his complete failure as a father. He'd let fear and prejudice drive away the one person who could heal his family, and now his children were paying the price. Margaret Sterling arrived from Boston like an avenging angel, her fury so potent it seemed to radiate heat. She surveyed the hospital room, her catatonic grandchildren, her devastated son, and unleashed the full force of her disappointment. "You let that vulture Victoria scare away the best thing that ever happened to this family," she said coldly. "Grace Washington loves those children more than life itself, and you stood by while she was painted as their destroyer." "Mother, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly. Your sister-in-law is a bitter woman who's been waiting 18 months for the chance to punish you for Sarah's death, and you handed her the weapon." Margaret's voice could have frozen blood. "And Sarah trusted you to protect their children, and instead you've let them be destroyed twice." The custody hearing proceeded without Alexander's presence. He refused to leave the hospital while his children fought for their psychological survival. Victoria arrived at court dressed in black like she was attending a funeral, her performance pitch-perfect as the grieving aunt who only wanted to save her niece and nephew from an unstable environment. The judge, an elderly man named Harrison who'd seen countless custody battles, listened to Victoria's carefully constructed narrative about inappropriate boundaries and emotional manipulation. Without Grace present to defend herself or Alexander there to provide context, the story sounded damning. "The children have been isolated from their extended family," Victoria testified, her voice breaking with manufactured emotion. "They've been taught to see their caregiver as their primary attachment figure, to the exclusion of all others. When I tried to visit, they barely acknowledged my existence. They've been programmed to reject anyone who isn't Miss Washington." Victoria's private investigator presented a portfolio of photographs taken with telephoto lenses. Grace hugging the children, Grace reading them bedtime stories, Grace comforting them during nightmares. In isolation, torn from context, the images looked sinister rather than loving. "The defendant's relationship with the children appears to cross appropriate professional boundaries," the investigator testified. "The level of physical affection, the exclusive bonding, the children's obvious preference for her over their biological family. It suggests an unhealthy dynamic that serves the caregiver's emotional needs rather than the children's best interests." Judge Harrison found himself troubled by the testimony. He'd seen cases where seemingly loving caregivers had isolated children from their families, creating unhealthy dependencies that served the adult's psychological needs. Without more context, Victoria's narrative seemed plausible, even probable. "Where are the children now?" he asked. "Hospitalized," Victoria said with perfect timing. "When Miss Washington disappeared, abandoned them without explanation, they suffered complete psychological breaks. They're currently sedated and under psychiatric care." The judge's expression darkened. A caregiver who would abandon traumatized children rather than face scrutiny looked exactly like someone with something to hide. He'd seen this pattern before: inappropriate relationships exposed, guilty parties fleeing rather than facing consequences. "Temporary custody is awarded to Victoria Ashworth," Judge Harrison announced. "The children will be placed in her care as soon as they're medically stable." Back at the hospital, Alexander watched his world crumble through safety glass. The twins had been moved to the psychiatric ward after Olivia attempted to climb out a third-story window, trying to find Mama Grace. They lay now in padded rooms, monitored around the clock, their small bodies chemical calm, but their spirits utterly shattered. Dr. Martinez found Alexander in the hallway at midnight, slumped against the wall like a man waiting for execution. "I've been treating traumatized children for 20 years, she said quietly. "I've never seen anything this devastating. They're not just grieving, they're disappearing inside themselves." "How do I fix this?" Alexander whispered. "You find Grace Washington and you bring her home. Today's hearing was a travesty of justice based on incomplete information and deliberate manipulation. These children are dying without her. Alexander looked through the window at his son, who hadn't moved in 6 hours, and his daughter, who kept writing "Grace" on the walls with her fingernails until the nurses covered her hands with mittens. The sight of their despair was like acid in his veins. "Victoria has custody now," he said helplessly. "Then you fight her with everything you have. You expose her lies, you tell the truth about Grace, and you save your children before they're lost forever." Dr. Martinez's voice carried the weight of professional authority and personal passion. "Because if those children spend much longer in this state, the damage won't be reversible." In her hotel room across town, Victoria Ashworth stood at the window overlooking the city lights, a glass of wine in her hand and satisfaction warming her chest. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The children would recover from their dramatic adjustment period, Alexander would be removed from their lives, and she would finally have the family she'd always deserved. She'd convinced herself that her actions were motivated by love, that she was saving Olivia and Owen from an inappropriate situation. But deep in her heart, where truth lived despite her denials, Victoria knew her real motivation was revenge. Against Alexander for surviving when Sarah didn't, against Grace for achieving the love Victoria had never found, against a world that had taught her that showing vulnerability was weakness. She raised her glass in a private toast to her victory, unaware that her foundation was already cracking, that truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deeply it's buried, and that sometimes justice comes wearing the face of a grieving grandmother armed with her dead daughter's diary. Margaret Sterling's investigation began with a single photograph tucked between the pages of Sarah's journal, a newspaper clipping from the Atlanta Constitution dated 3 years earlier. The headline read, "Pediatric Surgeon Saves 20 Children in Hospital Fire, Loses Own Son in Heroic Rescue." Below it, a grainy photo showed Grace Washington being loaded into an ambulance, her scrubs torn and bloodied, her face a mask of devastation. "My God," Margaret whispered, reading the article with growing horror. The story painted Grace not as a disgraced doctor who'd lost her license, but as a hero who'd sacrificed everything, including her own child, to save others. Marcus Washington, age 8, had died in the same fire his mother had run into repeatedly to rescue strangers' children. Grace had saved every child in the pediatric wing except her own son, whom she'd reached too late. The accompanying article detailed the aftermath. Grace's voluntary surrender of her medical license, not due to malpractice but from trauma-induced PTSD that made it impossible for her to practice. The hospital's negligent fire safety protocols had caused the tragedy, but Grace had shouldered the blame, disappeared from public life, and left behind the career that had defined her. Sarah had highlighted key passages in yellow, her neat handwriting filling the margins with notes. "This is who I want with my children if something happens to me. Someone who understands loss, someone who would sacrifice everything for a child's safety." Margaret's hands shook as she reached for her phone. Her private investigator, a former FBI agent named Patricia Wells, answered on the second ring. "I need you to find someone," Margaret said without preamble. "Grace Washington, former pediatric surgeon from Atlanta, and Patricia, I need you to dig deep. Someone has been telling lies about this woman, and those lies are destroying my family." While Margaret marshaled her resources, Alexander sat in the psychiatric ward watching his children waste away. 3 days under Victoria's legal custody had been devastating. The twins refused to eat, spoke only to ask for Grace, and recoiled from every medical professional who tried to help them. Their small bodies were failing as surely as their spirits. Dr. Martinez entered with test results that made Alexander's blood run cold. "Olivia's lost 6 pounds in 3 days. Owen's blood pressure is dangerously low. Their bodies are shutting down from trauma. If we can't break through to them soon—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Alexander had seen that look before, in the days before Sarah died. The careful, professional distance that doctors adopted when hope was slipping away. "There has to be something," Alexander said desperately. "There is Grace Washington." "I've reviewed their sessions, their progress notes, their psychological profiles. That woman didn't just care for your children, she performed medical miracles. The attachment they formed with her is the healthiest emotional bond they've experienced since their mother's death." Victoria chose that moment to arrive, her heels clicking authoritatively down the hospital corridor. She carried legal documents and wore the satisfied expression of someone accustomed to winning. Behind her walked a small army of court-appointed specialists, social workers, child psychologists, custody evaluators, all there to assess the twins' condition. "I'm here to evaluate my wards," Victoria announced to Dr. Martinez. "The court wants a comprehensive assessment of their psychological state." Alexander wanted to throttle her with his bare hands. "Your wards are dying, Victoria. They're literally dying from grief, and you're treating this like a legal exercise." "They're experiencing a difficult adjustment period," Victoria replied coldly. "Children are resilient. They'll adapt to appropriate care once the unhealthy attachment is fully severed." Dr. Martinez stared at Victoria like she was looking at a sociopath. "Severed attachment? These children have lost their primary caregiver after forming the first healthy bond they've had since their mother's death. What you're calling unhealthy is actually the most psychologically sound relationship they've ever experienced." "According to whose assessment?" Victoria's smile was sharp as a blade. "Because my experts tell a very different story." She gestured to the specialists behind her, expensive consultants who'd been paid handsomely to support her narrative. Alexander recognized the type from corporate litigation. Hired guns who would say whatever their client needed to hear. The lead psychologist, a man named Dr. Stevens, who looked like he'd never worked with actual children, cleared his throat officiously. "Miss Washington's relationship with the children exhibits classic signs of emotional manipulation. The exclusive bonding, the rejection of other caregivers, the extreme distress upon separation, these are hallmarks of an unhealthy dependency fostered by someone seeking to meet their own psychological needs." Dr. Martinez's professional composure cracked. "That's complete nonsense. Grace Washington formed a therapeutic attachment with traumatized children who had been failed by every previous caregiver. The bond they share is exactly what these children needed to heal. A bond that conveniently disappeared the moment legal scrutiny was applied," Dr. Stevens countered smoothly. "Innocent caregivers don't flee when questioned about their methods." The words hit Alexander like physical blows because they echoed his own doubts. Grace had left without fighting, without defending herself or the children she claimed to love. What kind of person abandoned traumatized children rather than face uncomfortable questions? But even as the doubt crept in, Alexander remembered Grace's letter. Some fights aren't worth the casualties they create. She hadn't fled from guilt. She'd fled from love, believing that removing herself from the battlefield would protect the children from a destructive war. "She left to protect them," Alexander said quietly. "She left because she was caught," Victoria snapped, her carefully controlled facade cracking for just a moment. "And now my sister's children are suffering the consequences of your poor judgment." The barb found its mark. Alexander's guilt over Sarah's death was a wound that never healed, a constant source of pain that Victoria exploited with surgical precision. She knew exactly how to twist the knife, how to make him doubt every decision, every instinct, every moment of happiness since his wife's death. 200 miles away, Grace sat in a Salvation Army shelter in Fresno, staring at a newspaper article about the custody battle that was destroying the family she loved. The headline read, "Tech Billionaire's Children Hospitalized After Nanny Abandonment." Her picture was prominently displayed, a candid shot from the mansion's security cameras that made her look predatory rather than protective. The article painted her as a manipulative opportunist who'd wormed her way into a wealthy family's trust before revealing her true nature. Anonymous sources, clearly Victoria or her investigators, provided quotes about inappropriate boundary violations and concerning attachment patterns. Grace was portrayed as the villain in a story where she'd been nothing but love incarnate. Her phone, a prepaid device with a cracked screen, buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Please call me. My name is Patricia Wells. I'm working with Margaret Sterling to find the truth. The children need you." Grace stared at the message for a long moment before deleting it. She'd made her choice. Walking away was the only way to protect Olivia and Owen from a custody battle that would traumatize them further. Better they hate her for leaving than be destroyed by staying. But as she watched the evening news footage of ambulances outside the Sterling mansion, her resolve began to crumble. The reporter mentioned that both children were in critical condition, that their psychological state was deteriorating rapidly. The children she'd sworn to protect were dying, and her sacrifice was meaningless if they didn't survive it. Meanwhile, Patricia Wells was uncovering information that would change everything. The private investigator had spent 3 days in Atlanta, tracking down Grace's former colleagues, reviewing hospital records, and interviewing the families whose children Grace had saved. The picture that emerged was nothing like Victoria's carefully constructed narrative. "Dr. Washington was the most dedicated physician I ever worked with," testified Dr. Jennifer Kim, Grace's former supervisor at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. She volunteered for extra shifts, took the most difficult cases, never lost a patient under her care. The night of the fire, she made 7 trips into that burning building. 7 times she risked her life to save children who weren't her own. The fire chief, Captain Robert Hayes, provided even more damning evidence. The hospital's fire suppression system failed due to negligent maintenance. Dr. Washington had filed reports about safety violations for months, but administration ignored them. When the fire started, she was off duty, but she rushed back and spent 4 hours pulling kids out of that inferno. Her son was in the ICU on the 5th floor. She saved every child on floors 1 through 4 before the roof collapsed and trapped her boy. The truth was devastating in its heroism and tragedy. Grace hadn't lost her medical license due to incompetence. She'd surrendered it voluntarily because survivor's guilt made it impossible for her to continue practicing. The families she'd saved had tried to honor her with awards and testimonials, but Grace had disappeared, unable to accept praise for failing to save the one child who mattered most to her. Patricia's investigation also uncovered something else: financial records showing that Victoria had paid Dr. Stevens and his team substantial consulting fees before they'd ever met the Sterling twins. The psychological assessment that painted Grace as manipulative had been purchased, not earned through legitimate evaluation. Armed with this evidence, Margaret Sterling requested an emergency hearing. Judge Harrison, the same man who'd awarded custody to Victoria, agreed to review new evidence that had come to light. He was troubled by reports of the children's deteriorating condition and suspicious about the speed with which the case had been decided. The night before the hearing, Alexander sat vigil in the hospital chapel, praying to a God he wasn't sure was listening. His children lay upstairs, hooked to machines that monitored their failing bodies while their souls slipped away. Victoria's hired experts claimed they were making excellent progress in their adjustment, but the medical staff told a different story. Both twins were exhibiting signs of failure to thrive syndrome. Their will to live was simply evaporating. Dr. Martinez found him there at midnight, her own faith shaken by what she'd witnessed. "I've called in every favor I have," she said quietly. Child Protective Services, the Medical Board, the Psychiatric Review Committee. This case is so far outside normal parameters that everyone's taking notice. Will it be enough? Alexander asked. I don't know, but your mother has something, evidence that could change everything. She won't tell me what it is, just says justice has a way of surfacing when children's lives are at stake. In her hotel room, Victoria Ashworth stood before the bathroom mirror, practicing her testimony for tomorrow's hearing. She would speak about her sister's children with tears in her eyes, about the inappropriate influence that had damaged their young minds, about her duty to protect them from further harm. But her reflection looked strange in the harsh fluorescent light, harder than she remembered, colder around the eyes. For just a moment she saw herself as others might, a bitter woman using children's trauma to settle old scores. The thought was so disturbing that she turned away quickly, focusing instead on the legal briefs that would secure her victory. She had no idea that truth was gathering like a storm outside her window. The justice was coming for her in the form of hospital records and fire department reports and the testimonies of 20 families whose children were alive because Grace Washington had been willing to die for them. Tomorrow would bring revelation. Tomorrow would bring reckoning. And tomorrow, the real fight for Olivia and Owen's souls would finally begin. The courtroom erupted in chaos as Margaret Sterling rose from the gallery, Sarah's journal clutched in her weathered hands like a weapon of truth. Judge Harrison had been reviewing Patricia Wells' evidence for 20 minutes. Hospital records, fire department reports, testimonials from 20 families whose children lived because Grace Washington had been willing to die for them. Your Honor, Margaret's voice cut through the murmur of shocked whispers, I have one more piece of evidence that changes everything. Victoria's face went ashen as her mother-in-law approached the bench with steady purpose. She recognized the leather journal immediately. Sarah's private thoughts, her final wishes, the secrets Victoria had assumed were buried with her sister. This is my daughter-in-law's journal, Margaret announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. Written in the months before her death, when she knew she was struggling with depression, when she was planning for the possibility that she might not survive. Judge Harrison accepted the journal with careful hands, his expression grave as he read Sarah's final entry aloud. If something happens to me, Alexander must find Grace Washington. I've researched her extensively. Former pediatric surgeon who lost her own son, saving other children. She understands trauma, understands loss, understands what Olivia and Owen will need to heal. She's not just their salvation, she's their destiny. The words hung in the air like a benediction, transforming the entire narrative in an instant. Grace wasn't an opportunistic interloper. She was Sarah's chosen guardian, handpicked by a dying mother who'd seen past society's prejudices to recognize true grace. Victoria stood abruptly, her carefully constructed composure finally cracking. That journal proves nothing. Sarah was mentally ill, not thinking clearly. Sarah was brilliant, Margaret interrupted, her voice sharp with protective fury. And she knew exactly what she was doing when she chose Grace Washington to love her children. Dr. Martinez took the stand next, her testimony delivered with surgical precision. She detailed the twins' remarkable progress under Grace's care, the healing of their attachment disorders, their transformation from traumatized shells into thriving children. She described their current condition in clinical terms that made the gallery gasp. Severe malnutrition, psychological regression, failure to thrive syndrome. In 30 years of practice, I have never seen children deteriorate this rapidly from emotional trauma, Dr. Martinez testified. Olivia and Owen are dying of broken hearts, literally willing themselves toward death because they believe love is temporary and abandonment is inevitable. The court-appointed specialists Victoria had hired squirmed in their seats as their bought opinions were systematically dismantled. Patricia Wells presented financial records showing the payments they'd received, the predetermined conclusions they'd been hired to reach. Their credibility evaporated like morning mist. But the most devastating moment came when Judge Harrison called an unexpected witness, Grace Washington herself. She entered the courtroom like a force of nature, her dignity intact despite days of hiding and heartbreak. Alexander's breath caught as he saw her, thin from not eating, exhausted from not sleeping, but still radiating the quiet strength that had first drawn his children to her light. Grace approached the witness stand with measured steps, her grandmother's lessons in carrying oneself with grace under pressure serving her well. She raised her right hand to be sworn in, her voice steady as she promised to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. "Miss Washington," Judge Harrison began gently, "why did you leave the Sterling children when they needed you most?" Grace's voice carried across the courtroom like music, her southern cadence wrapping around words heavy with pain and love. "Your Honor, I left because I thought it was the only way to protect them from being weapons in a war they didn't understand. I thought my absence would spare them the trauma of a custody battle." "And now?" the judge prompted. Grace's eyes found Alexander's across the courtroom, then shifted to the gallery where Margaret sat with tears streaming down her face. "Now I know that running from love doesn't protect anyone. It just creates more wounds for everyone to carry." Victoria made one last desperate attempt to salvage her case. "She abandoned sick children. What kind of person?" "The kind of person who sacrificed her medical career to save 20 children from a fire," Judge Harrison interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "The kind of person who lost her own son because she was too busy rescuing other people's children. The kind of person who loved Olivia and Owen Sterling enough to walk away rather than see them suffer." The judge's gavel fell like thunder. "Custody is immediately returned to Alexander Sterling." Victoria Ashworth's petition is denied, and this court recommends investigation into potential perjury charges regarding the fabricated psychological evaluations. Grace and Alexander reached each other at the same moment, their embrace witnessed by a courtroom full of people who'd just seen justice triumph over prejudice, love conquer fear, and truth emerge from beneath layers of calculated lies. "The children," Grace whispered against his chest, "are waiting for their mama to come home," Alexander replied, his voice breaking with relief and love and the promise of healing that was finally within reach. Outside the courthouse, photographers captured the moment when Grace Washington walked into the sunlight as a free woman, vindicated and victorious, ready to return to the children who'd been calling her name in their dreams. The fight was over. The healing could begin. The hospital room felt like a cathedral when Grace finally returned, sunlight streaming through windows that had seemed dark for so long. Olivia saw her first through the doorway, her small body going rigid with disbelief before erupting into movement that pulled every wire and tube free from her fragile frame. "Mama Grace!" The cry that tore from Olivia's throat was primal, desperate, a sound that spoke of resurrection and miracles. Owen followed seconds later, both children launching themselves at Grace with the force of bullets finding their target. Grace caught them against her chest, sinking to her knees as 18 months of love and loss and longing crashed over all three of them. She buried her face in their hair, breathing in the scent of hospital soap and little boy sweetness and little girl tears, feeling pieces of her shattered heart click back into place with each sob they shared. "I'm sorry," she whispered over and over, her southern accent thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry I left you, babies. Mama Grace is never leaving again. Never, never, never." Alexander stood in the doorway watching his family heal, tears streaming down his face as color returned to his children's cheeks for the first time in days. Dr. Martinez appeared beside him, her own eyes bright with professional satisfaction and personal joy. Their vital signs are already stabilizing, she murmured. Heart rate normalizing, blood pressure rising to healthy levels. I've seen medical miracles before, but nothing quite like this. Owen pulled back first, his small hands framing Grace's face as if memorizing every detail. "Are you real?" he whispered. "Or are you a dream like the bad ones?" "I'm real, baby boy. Real as your heartbeat, real as your daddy's love, real as this promise I'm making right now." Grace's voice carried the weight of vows spoken in sacred spaces. "No one is ever going to take me away from you again. No one is ever going to make you choose between love and safety. We're family now, forever and always." The word family hung in the air like a blessing, transforming the sterile hospital room into something holy. Margaret Sterling entered quietly, carrying legal documents that would make Grace's promise official. Adoption papers, custody agreements, financial arrangements that would ensure Grace never again had to choose between loving these children and surviving. "My grandson asked me to bring these," Margaret said softly, placing the papers on the bedside table. "He says he can't wait another minute to make you officially part of this family." Grace looked up through tears, seeing Alexander silhouetted in the doorway like an answered prayer. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Are you sure you want a woman like me in your perfect world?" Alexander stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Grace Washington, you are the perfect woman for our imperfect world. You're the mother my children chose, the partner my heart needs, the miracle my family deserves." He knelt beside them, completing their circle. "Will you marry me? Will you let us love you the way you've loved us?" The proposal was witnessed by two exhausted children, one wise grandmother, and a doctor who'd seen enough trauma to recognize true healing when it happened. Grace's answer came not in words, but in the way she pulled Alexander into their embrace, creating a knot of love so tight that nothing could ever break it again. 6 months later, they stood in the garden of their Palo Alto home, exchanging vows beneath an arch of white roses, while Olivia scattered petals and Owen carried rings tied with ribbon the color of hope. The wedding was small, intimate, attended by people who understood that some love stories are written in tears and sealed with redemption. Victoria Ashworth watched from a distance, her bitterness finally transformed into something approaching peace through months of therapy and the gradual recognition that she'd been fighting shadows instead of truth. She didn't approach the family, her presence would have been unwelcome and unnecessary, but she witnessed their joy with something that might have been approval. As Grace and Alexander kissed to seal their union, Olivia tugged at her new mother's wedding dress. "Mama Grace," she whispered, her voice carrying the confidence of a child who finally understood that love could be permanent. "Are we really a family now?" Grace knelt to meet her daughter's eyes, her voice steady with promises written in stardust and sealed with divine approval. "Baby girl, we've always been a family. Today, we're just making it official for the whole world to see." The sun set over their celebration like a benediction, painting the sky in shades of gold that matched the warmth in their hearts and the brightness of their future together. To our cherished listeners who've walked the long road of life, raised families, and understand that true love isn't about perfection, it's about staying when staying gets hard. Grace and Alexander's story reminds us that second chances can bloom at any age, that love sees beyond color and class, and that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. In our golden years, we learn that family isn't just about blood. It's about who shows up, who stays, and who loves us through our darkest storms. This story speaks to every grandparent who's watched their own children struggle, every heart that's known loss, and every soul that still believes in the power of unconditional love to heal impossible wounds. Share with us. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a love that defied society's expectations? What moment in your own family's journey reminds you that love truly conquers all? Leave your stories in the comments below. We'd be honored to read how love has transformed your own life.